have some tips for you today on transferring your embroidery pattern to your fabric for the Rainbow Sunshine Mini Quilt. The first tip is that you are going to want to make sure that you cut out your applique or your embroidery pattern, and then you're going to want to secure it to your fabric. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. The first is you use your light box or your window to kind of center your pattern. You can see through here where my pattern is, and then pin it in place. Then you can go ahead and transfer your pattern, or you can center your pattern on the back side of your fabric. And then I just used some pieces of clear tape to hold it into place. And then it makes it easy to flip it over and transfer the letters, trace over the letters, or and then flip it back over for the next step. If you don't have a light box and you're using a window, this is really a great method because it keeps everything nice and flat and allows you to easily trace. Now, one tip for tracing, I really prefer to use just a thin mechanical pencil. I like mechanical pencils because they're easy to find everywhere. You don't have to have a special thing for it. I like that you don't have to get your embroidery wet after you're done. So if you're using a water-soluble pen, you have to soak your entire piece to get rid of any stray marks, and I don't like that. And I just like that it's easy to find and have, and that your lines are nice and thin. If you are using a mechanical pencil, I have a couple of tips for you. The first is as you're drawing onto your fabric, to make sure that you're just using really short strokes to make sure that you're not pulling or stretching your fabric. And this is true for any kind of utensil that you're using that kind of drags across the surface. So make sure that you're just using thin, short strokes. The other thing that you want to do is make sure that you are going to be able to see your pattern once the back pattern is removed. So what I'll do when I'm tracing, I will trace a letter, and then I will turn off the light and make sure I can see my marks. And then the other step I will do is to lift it away from my pattern to make sure that I can still find my marks. Now this is very light, and that's on purpose because we want to be able to cover up these marks and not have to worry about them showing up in our pattern. But you want to make sure that it's dark enough that you can clearly see where you're supposed to be stitching. And the same thing is true with even if it's pinned in place. So you can see it's a lot easier to see on this tone-on-tone fabric than it is on this patterned fabric, but it's not impossible, and it's a lot easier for me to see up close. I'll for sure be able to stitch that down. The last thing that you want to do is make sure that you flip over and trace this circle on the wrong side of your fabric, because that's going to be your sewing guide when we go to do the turned edge applique. If you have taped it like I have here, then what I recommend doing is I trace around where there's not tape, and then I'll lift it up and remove the tape, and then come back and then mark those pieces that were covered by the tape. I also recommend using much smaller pieces of tape than I have here. It'll just make it a lot easier to go ahead and mark your circle. And again, in this instance, I used a black pen to show you this half circle because I wanted you to be able to clearly see it. Make sure that your marks are dark enough that you can see, but as light as possible. So there's a kind of a fine line there. I probably wouldn't use this black ink pen to do this. I would go ahead and just use my mechanical pencil again. But if you're having a hard time seeing your marks, go ahead and move on to a pen or some other way to mark it to make sure that you can clearly see where you're supposed to be sewing and stitching. So those are tips for setting up your embroidery hoop. Once I have the whole embroidery pattern traced and I have my circle traced on the back, then I am going to place my fabric on top of felt. That is my preferred method for the embroidery. In the pattern, there are a few different ways. You can use fusible fleece, you can use an adhesive interfacing, or you can just stitch on your plain piece of fabric and then use a second piece of fabric to do the needle turn or the turned edge applique. Whatever way you do, you want to make sure that you have some extra thickness to your embroidery pattern to make sure that you're going to hide any shadowing from the rays as they are around your sun to make sure that you're not seeing any extra fabric or colors shining through the bottom. So I will just place my pattern on top of my felt, and then I will take both of these together and I will place them inside my embroidery hoop so that it's tight but not distorted, and then I will get all of my stitching done.